The bass thudded through the wooden floorboards, vibrating up my legs as I tried to steady the tray full of glasses in my hands. 3 whiskeys neat, 2 vodka sodas, and something blue and glittering in a martini glass, a drink that cost more than I would make in tips on this freezing night. The air was thick. Cologne, perfume, cigarette smoke, and the scent of quiet despair blended into the signature aroma of the Velvet Room, the most exclusive nightclub in Chicago's River North. Table 7. "Don't spill," Marco barked as he passed, his shoulder slamming roughly into mine. I tilted the tray toward my hip, steadying the glasses, ignoring the dull ache in my heels, punishment from the 6-inch stilettos all of us waitresses were required to wear on every night shift. 6 hours down, 2 to go. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my uniform for the 3rd time in an hour. The hospital again. I couldn't answer this time. My mother would understand. She always did, even when she shouldn't have to. I slipped between tables, avoiding the men in tailored suits who never looked me in the eye, and the diamond-draped women who didn't even know I existed. The patrons of Velvet lived in another world, a world where medical bills didn't pile up on kitchen counters, where mothers didn't have to beg insurance companies to approve experimental treatments that might save their lives. "Your drinks, gentlemen," I said softly, setting each glass onto the black marble table. Table 7 was filled with regulars, men in their 40s, expensive watches, thick wallets. They tipped well when they won upstairs at the casino, and not a dime when they lost. "Thanks, sweetheart," one of them muttered, sliding a 50 toward me without lifting his eyes from his phone. "Keep the change." I tucked the bill into my apron and whispered a quick thank you to a man who had already forgotten me. But before I could turn away, the air in the room shifted. I felt it before I saw anyone. A collective breath caught. The noise dropped to a low hum. The DJ switched tracks, smooth and deliberate. The crowd parted like water, and 3 men walked into the clearing it created. The 2 on either side were clearly bodyguards, broad-shouldered, dressed in black, earpieces in place, faces expressionless, eyes scanning the room in ceaseless motion. But it was the man between them who made the entire place freeze. He wasn't particularly tall, yet every step he took carried a weight that bent the world around him. His hair was neatly cropped on the sides, the top combed back, his jaw sharp as a blade, his dark eyes swallowing every trace of light. The charcoal gray suit he wore fit with such precision it didn't need to flaunt its price. I'd worked at Velvet Room for 7 months, but I had never seen him before. Still, I knew exactly who he was. Everyone in that room did. Nathaniel Callahan, owner of the Velvet Room, of this entire building, and perhaps half of River North, a man spoken of only in whispers. I turned away quickly, heading back toward the bar, a survival instinct. Like seeing a predator in the wild, the last thing you should do is meet its eyes. If you're still here with Rachel, you can probably feel the heavy breath of a Chicago night too, the way the music trembles with exhaustion and the gaze of a powerful man, cold as steel, stops on her for the first time. Everything is about to change, and sometimes destiny begins in the moments we barely notice. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video if you believe small stories of light and shadow deserve to be heard. And where are you listening from? Comment your city or country below so we'll know Rachel and Nathaniel's story has reached your heart wherever you are in the world. I hurried back behind the counter, my heart still pounding from the weight of his presence. Nathaniel Callahan. I had never spoken to him, had only just seen him for the first time, but I'd heard enough to know he was not the kind of man whose attention you wanted. He was the club's owner, yes, but also a significant player in the network of power that everyone in Chicago knew existed but no one dared to name. I wondered why he had chosen to appear at Velvet tonight, and more than that, why it had felt as though his gaze had brushed against me. I pushed the thought aside and focused on the rest of my shift. A little over an hour left. I could endure it. I'd endured worse. My name is Rachel Miller, 32 years old, only child of a working-class family from southern Ohio. My father died of a stroke when I was 15. My mother, Carolyn Miller, a retired nurse with a gentle smile and a spine of steel, did everything she could to raise me. After graduating with a degree in English literature, I dreamed of becoming a teacher or an editor, but life leaves no one untouched. 2 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Her retirement insurance barely covered chemotherapy, let alone the new experimental drugs. After a string of part-time jobs and mounting debt, I moved to Chicago, taking whatever work could keep her treatments going. Working at Velvet wasn't ideal, but it was the only place that paid enough to keep my mother alive. From 9 at night until 3 in the morning, I walked in heels too high, wearing a smile just polite enough to neither invite nor offend, weaving between glances and wandering hands. I learned who was happy, who was drunk, who was about to cause trouble. I learned how to answer gracefully, refuse gracefully, let everything pass as if I were simply part of the glittering backdrop. And every morning, I caught the first bus back to my small apartment on the city's west side, cooked porridge, did the laundry, then headed to the University of Chicago hospital to sit by my mother's bed. She still smiled when she saw me, still joked that I was too thin, still held my hand with a faith that sometimes I couldn't even hold for myself. On the worst days, I slipped into the hospital bathroom, cried for a few minutes, and came out as if nothing had happened. On the worst nights, I lay staring at the cracked ceiling of my apartment, wondering if anyone in the world could see how close I was to falling apart. I wasn't living, I was surviving, carrying each day on the fragile hope that the trials would work, that my mother would pull through, that someday I could read books for pleasure again instead of escape. But I never once believed anyone truly saw me. Until tonight. The night when the eyes of the most powerful man in the room seemed to rest on me for longer than a heartbeat. I didn't know whether it was a blessing or a warning, but I could feel something beginning, something that would push my life off the narrow path I had fought so hard to stay on. And like every storm, it began in silence. I was checking the last order of my shift when Elena, one of the senior waitresses, came over and lowered her voice. "Rachel, someone's asking for you." "Who?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the tray of glasses. Elena glanced toward the VIP section behind the heavy dark blue velvet curtain. "Callahan." My heart skipped a beat. "What did he say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just said to see him when you're free," Elena whispered, her eyes a mixture of surprise and unease. I looked at the clock. About 15 minutes left in my shift. I nodded, asked Elena to handle my last table, washed my hands, fixed my hair, and walked toward the curtain. The room beyond was detached from the noise outside. The lighting was soft gold, the ceiling high, the velvet chairs plush, everything designed to exude power and distance. Nathaniel Callahan stood near the bar, one hand holding a glass of whiskey, the other tucked casually into his pocket. He didn't look at me right away. I waited in silence, unsure whether to speak first or stand still. After a few seconds that stretched like hours, he turned. His gray eyes locked on me, unblinking, unsmiling. "Rachel Miller, isn't it?" I nodded, my chest tightening. I had never heard my name spoken in a voice that was both deep and razor-sharp. "It seems you're the only one here not trying to get my attention," he said, setting his glass down. I didn't know what to say, so I only gave a small nod. The silence between us wasn't quite uncomfortable, but it was far from easy. "I saw you out there," I murmured, my voice barely brushing the air. "I know," Callahan replied, "and I've been watching you for some time." The word watching froze me in place. It carried something heavier, colder than simple observation. I didn't understand what he meant. He stepped closer, not fast, but with enough intention that I could feel the space between us shrinking by design. "Don't worry. I didn't call you in here to cause trouble. I just wanted a conversation." I had never spoken to the owner of the place I worked in. I wasn't sure if this was normal or dangerous. I stayed quiet. Callahan seemed to sense my tension. "You've worked here 7 months. Never missed a shift. Always on time. Never complained. You also don't accept invitations from clients, though many have tried." I froze. Those details weren't things he could have learned from a glance. He must have looked into me. "Do you know how I know that?" he asked. "Because you had someone follow me," I said softly but firmly. "Unnecessary," he replied. "I run this place. I know everything that happens in my space. You stand out not because you try to be noticed, but because you don't. And that makes you different." I couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a warning, or what I was supposed to say in response. "I'm just an employee," I managed, trying not to let my voice tremble. "And I'm someone who can completely change your life," Callahan said calmly, in a tone so even it sent a chill down my spine. "I don't understand," I whispered, my heartbeat quickening. He paused, his eyes fixed on me like he was reading a file only he could see. "I have an offer for you, Rachel. A different kind of job. One I believe only you can do." Before I could react, he continued. "Not at the club. A private position. Close to me. Triple your current pay. Full-time. Comprehensive health coverage. And most importantly, Access to the city's highest-tier private medical network. I stood frozen. The words echoed in my head full time. Insurance, treatment. I thought of my mother, of the prescriptions we had to split in half because we couldn't afford more. I tried to steady my breath. "Why me?" I asked. "Because I see something most people don't have," he said. "Courage. And loyalty that can't be bought. The qualities I need in the person who stands beside me." Callahan slipped a hand into his pocket, pulled out a gray envelope, and placed it on the table beside me. "Inside are the details, and everything you'll need to consider. Don't answer now, but don't make me wait too long." His voice dropped low, still sharp enough to cut glass. Then he turned away, ending the conversation without ceremony. I reached for the envelope, my hand trembling slightly. As I stepped out of the VIP room, my heart pounded so violently it felt as if it might burst from my chest. I knew, in that instant, my life had begun to turn onto another path, and I wasn't sure whether it led toward salvation or straight into the abyss. I left the Velvet just before 3 a.m, the gray envelope heavy in the pocket of my coat. The January wind in Chicago screamed through my ears, so cold it burned my cheeks, but I barely felt it. My mind spun with every word Nathaniel Callahan had said. A private position, full-time, triple the pay, comprehensive insurance, private medical care. Those words played over and over in my head like a broken tape. I couldn't sleep that night. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea in my hand, I stared at the envelope as if it might open itself and give me an answer. I knew that once I opened it, I would be one step closer to him, but how could I not open it? When the first light began to rise, I picked it up. Inside was a 3-page contract, neatly printed, free of any ornament. Position, personal assistant. Direct supervisor, Nathaniel Callahan. Duties, managing schedule, coordinating internal communication, overseeing certain special operations, and assisting in personal meetings. No prior experience required. Salary, 6 figures a year, plus housing and travel allowances, top-tier health insurance, and access to one of the 3 most exclusive private medical networks in the city. I read and reread the last section. Effective upon signing, 1-month probation, terminable at any time by either party. No explicit binding clauses, yet nothing clearly defined what special operations entailed. I thought about it all day. I brought the contract to the hospital and sat by my mother's bed in silence. She was asleep, her thin face rising and falling gently beneath the oxygen mask. I held her hand and wondered if she woke, and asked what I had done to keep her alive. Could I look her in the eyes and say I had done everything? When I returned home, I called the only friend I trusted in this city, Jenna. We'd gone to college together. She now worked for a private law firm. I asked her to review the contract. She didn't speak for several minutes, just flipped through the pages slowly. Finally, she looked up. "If this were a normal company, I'd tell you not to sign. But from what you've told me, this isn't a company, and Nathaniel Callahan isn't a normal man." "What do you think he wants from me?" I asked. Jenna shrugged. "You have 2 things most people around him don't: loyalty and honesty. Maybe he needs someone outside his old network, or maybe he needs a pawn. The question is, are you willing to put yourself on that board?" I couldn't answer, because I didn't know. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of my old white blouse, the one I wore only for job interviews. I arrived at Velvet an hour early, not through the employee entrance, but directly through the VIP door. The guard recognized me, nodded, and opened it without a word. Nathaniel was standing near the window, looking out at the city, a cup of black coffee in his hand. I said nothing. He didn't turn around. Finally, I spoke. "I accept, but I have conditions." He turned then, his eyes still cold, though something like curiosity flickered beneath. "You have 10 minutes. Speak." I swallowed hard. "I'll work for 1 month. After that, I can walk away if it doesn't feel right, no obligations. My mother receives full treatment during that time, no promises beyond that. I'm not your subordinate, I'm a collaborator. Nothing more, nothing less." Callahan was silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded. "Agreed. I'll have your mother transferred to the treatment center this afternoon. As for you, Rachel, you start now." He extended his hand. I looked at it, large, cold, powerful. I raised mine and placed it in his. The handshake wasn't between an employer and an employee. It felt more like the moment between a player and someone stepping into the game for the first time. A game whose rules I didn't know, but there was no turning back. That afternoon, only 2 hours after shaking hands with Nathaniel Callahan, I received a call from the hospital. The familiar nurse's voice informed me that my mother would be transferred to the Northfield Private Medical Center, one of the most advanced and expensive facilities in Chicago. They had arranged everything. A private ambulance, her medical records, even the transition paperwork, all completed within hours. The efficiency was dizzying. I hurried out of Velvet, changed out of my uniform, and caught a cab to the old hospital. When I arrived, my mother was already on a stretcher, wrapped in a thick blanket, 2 medical staff standing at her sides. Her face looked paler than it had the day before, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet when she saw me, she still tried to smile. "Rachel, what's happening? Where are they taking me?" I took her hand, leaned down, and whispered softly, trying to reassure both her and myself. "I've found a way, Mom. You'll get better care there. You don't have to worry anymore." She started to speak but stopped. Her cold fingers tightened around mine, as if she were trying to pass on the last bit of warmth she still carried. I followed the ambulance to Northfield. The facility sat in the northern part of the city, surrounded by trees and glass buildings that shimmered in the winter light. Everything about the place radiated calm, cleanliness, and a kind of distance like a world far removed from people like us. When my mother was settled into her private room, a quiet space with a window overlooking a snow-covered garden, I could hardly believe it was real. The room was equipped with modern machines, a chair for visitors, and a small monitor displaying every vital sign in real time. Her new doctor was a middle-aged woman with a calm, steady voice and sharp, intelligent eyes. She explained the new treatment plan, which included a rare experimental medication for which my mother had just qualified. I listened like someone lost at sea, trying to memorize every detail, every dosage, every time slot, but what I remembered most clearly was the way she said, "We'll do everything we can, and this time, Mrs. Carolyn truly has a chance." When I stepped out of the room, snow had begun to fall gently outside. I leaned against the hallway wall, gripping the strap of my bag, eyes lifted toward the white ceiling. A long breath escaped me, not quite relief, but something close. For the first time in months, I felt like more than a small boat drifting through a storm. Something had shifted. It was as if a door had quietly opened. And for the first time, I thought that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been wrong to step into that game. I returned to my old apartment by the end of the day. The room was the same, bare, cold, bathed in the dull glow of an aging yellow lamp. But when I set my bag down and looked out at the faint city lights beyond the window, everything felt different. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't powerless. And I had something I had long since stopped believing in: hope. That night, for the first time in months, I slept through the night without dreams of hospitals, bills, or the sound of a ventilator. In that deep sleep, the only image that remained was my mother's hand holding mine, weak, yet steady enough to keep me tethered to life. The next morning, a sleek black car was waiting in front of my apartment at 7 o'clock sharp. The driver, dressed in a tailored suit, greeted me with a polite nod and opened the door without a word. I had packed the night before just a few sets of clothes, my old laptop, a photo of my mother in her youth, and a worn leather notebook whose corners had long frayed. As the car pulled away from the rundown neighborhood I had called home for over a year, I looked out the window and watched it fade into the morning mist, the hum of the engine unnervingly soft. I didn't know where I was going, only that it was somewhere new, a new job, a new life, and that the rules would no longer be the same. The car stopped in front of a tall building near the river, exuding a cold kind of luxury. The driver led me to a private elevator, no floor numbers, no buttons, just a single card swipe and a brief vibration before the doors opened on the penthouse level. The apartment was unlike anything I had ever seen, and not at all what I imagined for a man like Nathaniel Callahan. It wasn't ostentatious, nor over-decorated, yet every detail was deliberate, as if perfection itself had been measured and built into the walls. Walnut wood, thick glass, black steel, natural light spilling through thin curtains, and a silence so complete it felt alive. A woman in her 50s greeted me at the door, her hair neatly pinned, dressed in black, composed and efficient. She introduced herself as Elise, head of household operations and administration for Mr. Callahan. From now on, I would be living in the personal assistant's residence 1 floor below the penthouse, and working directly with her to learn the procedures. Her voice was even and calm, the kind of tone you hear in luxury hotels where everything functions without question. She gave me a brief tour. My apartment had one bedroom, a small office, a kitchen, and a living area with a wide window facing the Chicago River. Everything was ready, the wardrobe already stocked, even the shoes in exactly my size. Elise didn't explain how she knew, and I didn't ask. After a simple lunch, I was taken to a small conference room where I saw, for the first time, the detailed work schedule. Start at 8 a.m., end time, undefined. There would be a driver if I needed to leave the building. All meetings were confidential, all documents encrypted and stored internally. I was issued a work phone and a laptop preloaded with security software. Elise emphasized 3 principles. Never ask unless necessary, never share unless permitted, and always be prepared. She didn't sound threatening, but she didn't need to. I understood. This was a place where every movement was observed. Every mistake came with a cost. By the end of the day, I was brought upstairs to see Callahan again. He was seated behind a large wooden desk, the light from behind cloaking his face in shadow. I stood quietly, not daring to sit until he gestured. Elise left the room and closed the door softly. He lifted his gaze, signaling me to sit. "I've heard about your work today," Callahan said evenly. I nodded. Elise was very helpful. He didn't smile. "Good. But starting tomorrow, I want you to operate independently. Elise will assist only when required. One more thing, you'll begin attending personal meetings. Observe, take notes, don't speak." I blinked, surprised, but nodded. "I understand." Nathaniel was silent for a moment, then asked, "Are you afraid, Rachel?" I met his eyes. "I don't know. Maybe. But I'm ready." He nodded, a faint flicker of approval passing through his expression. "That's the right answer." That night, I returned to my apartment, turned on the bedroom light, and stood before the large window overlooking the city. The yellow lights shimmered on the river, the cars below streaking like faint lines of fire. I was no longer the waitress in a short skirt and 6-inch heels. I had stepped into another world, a world that ran smoothly, precisely, and coldly, like a machine. And from now on, I was part of it. The apartment assigned to me sat just below Nathaniel Callahan's penthouse, minimalist in design, yet so meticulously elegant that I couldn't shake the feeling of being misplaced inside a space I was merely allowed to inhabit. Everything was immaculate, precise, and almost too clean, as though no one had ever truly lived there. Dark walnut floors, marble countertops, cream leather chairs, and abstract paintings whose meanings escaped me, all arranged in perfect, emotionless balance. The bedroom had floor-to-ceiling windows that opened to the Chicago River, where the bridges in the distance cast their reflections across the water. It was a view for those who no longer worried about survival, only about power and control. I unpacked my belongings, placing each item neatly into drawers, a reflex born of years of quiet discipline, then sat down on the single armchair in the living room. The space felt more like a gallery than a home. But I knew comfort wasn't the purpose here. This was a testing ground, a stage where every movement was being watched, and I began to sense that clearly from the people who surrounded me. The first was Elise, the woman who always appeared at the exact right moment, never early, never late. She spoke sparingly, but every word carried weight. She was never impatient, never warm, never cruel either. I had never seen her smile, yet I couldn't dislike her. Elise was the embodiment of the quiet machinery that kept this place running, and I knew that any mistake I made would not escape her notice. Then there were the 2 men whose names I was never told. They never greeted me, only nodded when we passed. One was tall and lean, always in a gray suit, hair cropped close. The other was shorter, broad-shouldered, with a small scar near his left jaw. They stood like shadows guarding the penthouse corridor. I didn't know if they were Nathaniel's personal security or part of something larger, but I knew they weren't there for show. Every time I stepped out of my apartment, I felt eyes following me, never directly, just enough to remind me I was not unseen. In the elevator, I was never truly alone. Even when the mirrored walls reflected only my pale, composed face, the sensation of being watched lingered like thin smoke. The meetings with Nathaniel did little to ease my nerves. He rarely spoke to me in front of others. I took notes, organized files, supplied information when asked, but I knew he observed me more closely than anyone else, not out of suspicion, but as if assessing how I would respond to each situation, each word, each new presence in the room. One morning, when I entered the conference room 15 minutes early as usual, A man I had never seen before was already seated at the table. He looked to be in his 50s, hair silver and neatly combed, his manner polished, his gaze piercing. He studied me in silence for a long moment before giving a faint, knowing smile. "You're the new one." I nodded, saying nothing. He didn't offer a name, just flipped through the file in front of him and said quietly, "Nathaniel has taken risks for many people, but never for anyone like you. I hope you understand whether that's fortune or danger." When Nathaniel entered, the man fell silent instantly, his tone shifting into something brisk and professional, as though his previous words had never existed. But that single sentence echoed in my head all day. I began to understand that this world wasn't simply about work or efficiency. It was a network of unseen glances, layered meanings, and unspoken tests of loyalty. The apartment beneath the penthouse wasn't just a place to live. It was a boundary line between the life I once had and the world I had stepped into. And I was standing on a thin wire, balanced between two sides of my own existence. The phone issued to me on my very first day was unlike anything I had ever seen. No brand logo, no SIM slot, no social media apps, nothing familiar at all. The screen was deep black, displaying only 3 icons: internal contacts, work calendar, and an encrypted call interface. Elise explained that the device was custom-built for Callahan's internal network, impossible to trace from the outside, but that also meant every action performed on it was logged and monitored. She said it casually, as though she were reading from a lunch menu, without the faintest suggestion that my personal privacy had just become an obsolete concept. I didn't ask further. But from that moment, a cold understanding began to take shape. Every word I spoke, every step I took, every message I sent in this world could become a record stored somewhere, watched by someone. At some unknown time, I tried calling my mother using my old phone, but the signal was so weak that only fragments of our conversation came through. When I asked Elise if I could use a personal device within the workplace, she looked at me briefly and replied, "Not recommended. It's not safe." Not safe for whom? I wanted to ask, but stayed silent. During meetings with Nathaniel, I always noticed he never carried a regular phone either. He used one identical to mine, never leaving it unattended for more than a few minutes. Once, I caught a glimpse of a flashing message on his screen as he set it down. "Secure network temporarily disrupted." Switching to internal encryption mode, he glanced at it for less than a second before shutting it off, entirely calm, as if control was the air he breathed. But I couldn't be that composed. The sense of being watched began to seep into my sleep. I started thinking about every word I typed, every phrase I spoke, every reaction I made. Everything felt magnified under an invisible lens, observed, analyzed, archived. I didn't know who stood behind that glass. Was it Callahan? Elise? Some unseen security unit operating behind closed doors? I wasn't sure, but I could feel it, an awareness surrounding me, constant and deliberate. Not just observation, but evaluation. The same kind of gaze Callahan gave me in meetings. Not harsh, not kind, sharp, unflinching, as though he had already read every page of me long before I walked through that first door. Once, I caught that look while I was typing in my office. I looked up, and he was standing beyond the glass wall, silently watching. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood there for a few seconds before walking away. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being stripped bare lingered. One late night, I opened the phone, wanting to text Jenna, the only person I still kept contact with outside this world. But then I set it down. I couldn't be sure whether that message would reach her or be redirected, read, archived. In this world, trust had become a luxury, and silence seemed safer than any password. Since moving into the apartment beneath the penthouse, I had come to realize that no door was ever truly closed, and sometimes, silence was the only way to keep something for myself, a small, untouched corner of my being that still belonged to me, and me alone. I was reviewing the schedule for the upcoming week when an email arrived from Elise. The subject line was simple: "Documents for immediate processing." It contained an encrypted file, along with instructions for decoding it using the internal device I'd been issued. Everything seemed routine until I saw the name that appeared at the very top of the file once I opened it. Daniel Miller, my father's name. Inside was an internal security report dated nearly 20 years ago, referencing an incident that had never been publicly disclosed. It involved an internal investigation within an underground financial network based in Cleveland. At first, I thought it had to be a coincidence. Daniel Miller wasn't exactly a rare name. And my father, the gentleman who'd worked as an accountant for a small local company, had never been involved in anything remotely illicit. At least, that was what I had always believed. But the details in the report chilled me. Daniel Miller, born in 1960, graduate of Ohio State University, employed in internal accounting for a private business chain, suspected of leaking information to a third party, and placed under internal surveillance for more than 6 months before his death. I read the passage again and again. My father had died of a stroke. I remembered it vividly. He had collapsed in the bathroom one morning when I was 15. The doctor's diagnosis was acute cerebral hemorrhage. No one had questioned it. But this document hinted at something else entirely. And what unsettled me further was the name Keegan. The report mentioned Keegan multiple times, labeled as a mid-level coordinator in charge of supervising the internal accounting team, and the last person to see my father alive within 24 hours of his death. No surname, just a name adrift among codes and reference numbers, yet it hooked into my mind like a fishhook. Keegan. My mother had never mentioned anyone by that name. In my memory, my father never spoke of any boss or colleague who stood out. He had been a quiet, punctual, modest man, a model father, but now everything I thought I knew about him felt uncertain. I sat staring at the screen for a long time. Something about it was deeply wrong, though I couldn't yet grasp what. Why had I been given access to this file? It couldn't be coincidence. Elise had sent it, but under whose order? And did Nathaniel Callahan know what was inside? I thought of his eyes every time he looked at me, the pauses between his words. Maybe he had known all along. Maybe the reason he'd chosen me wasn't as simple as I'd believed. That evening, after everyone had left, I went into Callahan's office. He was still there, working. When he looked up and saw me, he didn't seem surprised. "You have a question?" I nodded. My voice trembled slightly, but I didn't back down. "My father, Daniel Miller, does he have anything to do with what's happening here?" Nathaniel was silent for a moment. He set his pen down, leaned back in his chair, and studied my face as if searching for something in it. He didn't deny it. He didn't pretend ignorance. He simply asked, "How much did you read?" I clenched my hands. Enough to know he wasn't just the ordinary man I thought he was. "And I want to know who Keegan is." He exhaled slowly, and for the first time since I'd started working there, I saw a flicker of weariness cross his eyes. "Keegan is still alive, and he isn't just part of your father's past. He's part of my present. What your father got caught in wasn't his fault, but its consequences are still echoing now." I stood frozen, my thoughts spinning, shards of new knowledge colliding. Part of me wanted to run. Another part wanted to dig deeper, because if I didn't uncover the truth about my father's past, I would never understand why I was here, why I had been drawn into this web of secrets. And I knew then, this was only the beginning. The real questions were just starting to unfold. I left Nathaniel's office that night with more than one question haunting my mind. Who was Keegan in my father's life? Why did that name still echo inside the network Nathaniel controlled? And if Callahan knew everything my father had been entangled in, why had he brought me into his world? I couldn't sleep. All night, I turned over the details in the file, the things Nathaniel had said and the things he had chosen not to say. I knew I couldn't keep doing this job without understanding the truth, not just because I wanted to protect my mother, but because if I was merely a pawn placed in this game because of my bloodline, I needed to know what role I was playing. The next morning, I waited for Nathaniel outside his private meeting room. The moment he appeared, I spoke. "I need to talk." His gaze lingered on me for a few seconds before he gave a slight nod. "Come into the office." The door closed behind us. I didn't wait for him to sit. I was no longer the quiet girl who endured in silence. I straightened my shoulders and met his eyes head on. "I want you to tell me everything. About my father, about Keegan, about why you really chose me." Nathaniel remained standing, his gray eyes unblinking. For a few seconds, the air between us thickened, heavy with something unsaid. Then he spoke, slowly but firmly. "All right, but I warn you some things. Once you hear them, you can never go back to who you were before." "I'm ready," I said. Or at least, I thought I was. He sat down, interlaced his fingers, and began. "Your father, Daniel Miller, was one of the few honest men who ever worked within the underground financial network my father built back in the 1990s. He didn't join out of ambition. He joined because he needed money to support his family. But he wasn't like the others. He couldn't ignore what he discovered: corruption, money laundering, bribery of officials. Daniel started gathering evidence in secret, and he planned to hand it over to an outsider. Keegan found out. He was the one overseeing the accounting division back then, my father's right hand. When he discovered what Daniel intended, Keegan wanted to eliminate him immediately. But my father, Charles Callahan, stopped him. He respected Daniel. He believed he could control the situation without violence. But things went too far. Daniel refused to stop. Keegan acted behind my father's back. I froze. You mean? Nathaniel nodded. There's no official proof. But I know. Your father's death wasn't natural. It wasn't a stroke. Keegan arranged it, cleanly. No trace, no investigation, everything covered. I stepped back, as if struck in the chest. I had lived nearly 20 years believing a completely different truth. Every memory of my father was suddenly clouded with doubt and grief. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why let me work here beside the people tied to his death? Nathaniel rose from his chair, his voice lowering. Because I owe him. My father failed to protect Daniel. He let Keegan grow too powerful, and I swore I would never repeat that mistake. When I learned you were Daniel's daughter, I had you watched. I needed to know if you had his courage, his integrity, and you do. You are unlike anyone who has ever walked into this place. You are the redemption I can offer for the past my father left behind. I looked at him, emotions surging, anger, sorrow, gratitude all colliding inside me until I couldn't speak. Nathaniel stepped closer, gentle but never imposing. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. I'll continue supporting your mother. You have the right to walk away from this game. I shook my head, tears spilling before I could stop them. I'm not going anywhere. Not while I can still uncover the truth. Not while Keegan is still out there. And not while my father's name remains unvindicated. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Then we moved forward together. And in that moment, I knew the bond between us was no longer just about work, no longer just about duty. It was something deeper, more dangerous, and utterly impossible to turn back from. When Nathaniel told me that Keegan had returned to Chicago and was hiding in an abandoned warehouse on the west side of the city, I knew the moment of reckoning had finally come. I didn't ask why he wanted me to go with him, nor how much he trusted me. I simply nodded, pulled on a dark coat, tied my hair back, and climbed into the car in silence. During the drive, my heartbeat was slow but steady, like a measured knock echoing inside my chest, compressing all the years of quiet grief over my father's death into a single surge of burning blood. The warehouse sat behind an old gas station long forgotten, its peeling paint curling like snakeskin, the wind whistling through broken windows, creating a sound that felt like the weary sigh of time itself. When I stepped inside, the weak yellow light from an overhead industrial lamp illuminated only part of the face of the man waiting in the shadows. Keegan. He was older than I had imagined, but his eyes were still sharp and cold, like a blade that had never dulled. He didn't seem surprised to see me. Instead, he gave a faint, knowing smile, as though everything had unfolded just as he expected. Rachel Miller, Daniel's daughter. So you finally came. I clenched my hands to stop them from trembling. My voice came steadier than I thought it would. You know why I'm here. He nodded, stepping slowly out of the darkness. No more pretense. No more circling around the truth. He looked at me as if I were just the ghost of a past he had once torn apart and left behind. Your father was a good man, Keegan said, and his tone carried no mockery. He didn't belong in that world. Too soft, too trusting, and because of that, he paid the price. The words struck like a slap, but I didn't crumble. I stood straight, my eyes locked on his. You killed my father. Keegan shrugged. I ordered the cleanup, yes. But the choice was his. He could have stayed silent. He could have looked away. He chose to do what was right. And sometimes, the price of righteousness is life itself. So what? You expect me to stay silent now, the way you once wished my father would? I asked, my voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from anger burning through my throat. Keegan gave a faint smile. I want you to understand that this isn't a story of black and white. You work for Callahan now. You live inside the same system your father once fought against. Do you really think you're any different? Do you think you'll change anything? I took a step closer, looking directly into the eyes that had been the last my father saw before he died. I'm not him, but I'm not you either. I don't kill to keep silence, and I won't let you do it again to anyone. There were no guns, no threats, just a confrontation of eyes, of grief that had never healed. Keegan sighed, as though he had just heard a verdict. He turned away, for the first time without an answer. Perhaps he was old. Perhaps he knew his time was ending. Perhaps he had been waiting for this very moment, the moment when the blood of the past would come to face him, to forgive or not forgive, to condemn or to let go. I turned and walked out, my hand still clenched. I didn't need to strike back. The truth had done that for me. When I stepped outside, the midday sunlight hit my eyes so hard I had to close them for a few seconds. But inside, I felt brighter than ever before. I had not chosen their way. I had chosen to stand in the dark without letting it consume me, and for the first time, I felt that my father could see me from somewhere and that he was proud. A week after the confrontation at the warehouse, Keegan disappeared from Chicago. No one publicly confirmed what had happened, but in the morning meetings, the positions he once held were quietly reassigned to younger, more discreet men. Elise said nothing. Yet the faint look she gave me as she handed over the internal report told me enough this was a retreat under terms. Keegan hadn't been erased, at least not in the way others in this world were removed when they betrayed or disrupted the order. He had walked away in silence, carrying with him a fragment of the old shadow, and in return, there was a fragile calm that everyone accepted as the settlement of a debt. But I felt no relief. I couldn't understand why Nathaniel had allowed him to leave, rather than finish things definitively. That night, as we sat by the window in his office with the city glittering beneath us, I asked him directly. He didn't look at me. He took a slow sip of whiskey and said, "There are things that, if pushed to the edge, can turn back and destroy you. Keegan is history. We don't need to kill him to win. We just need him to know his time is over." I stared at the unfinished files on the desk, thinking of the hundreds of names and thousands of numbers shifting each day, and I knew he was right. Yet part of me still longed for a clean ending, a final period large enough to erase what had been. The truth is, there is no perfect justice in this world. There is silence, there are deals, there is the slow slide into forgetfulness, and sometimes forgiveness isn't given because someone deserves it, but because we can't bear to carry hate any longer. The next evening, I sat alone in my apartment and opened my father's old notebook. Inside were notes on expenses, a few lines from books he loved, and one sentence I had never noticed before, written in faded blue ink. Truth cannot stay buried forever, but forgiveness is what keeps us from becoming monsters. I didn't know when he had written it, perhaps in those final days, when he could feel the invisible noose tightening around him. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest, and for the first time, I let the tears fall freely. Not from pain, but because the sorrow had lived inside me for so long that when it finally spilled out, I felt lighter. Still, I knew one thing with certainty. Every choice comes with a price. Keegan might have retreated, but his shadow remained within old connections, among loyalists who had yet to reveal themselves. Inside files I still had no clearance to open. The cost of forgiveness has never been cheap, and I was beginning to see its signs already. A staff member reassigned without warning, a meeting canceled at the last minute, a chain of internal documents suddenly re-encrypted for no reason. Everything felt like preparation for another wave. I didn't know what that wave would wash away, but I knew I would no longer be the one swept along. I had chosen to stand in the middle. I had chosen forgiveness, but not forgetfulness. And I would guard the truth as my father once did, this time with eyes wide open and a heart no longer alone, because the world has never been fair. Yet within that unfairness, sometimes we discover the truest strength we have. That night, rain fell heavily, the drops beating steady rhythms against the long glass windows stretching from ceiling to floor in Nathaniel's office. I walked in after Elise informed me he wanted to see me, assuming it would be another one of those unplanned meetings. But when the door closed behind me, there were no papers on the desk, no screens lit, no detailed schedules spread before him as there usually were. Only Nathaniel, standing with his back to me, a glass of whiskey in hand, gazing at the city blurred by rain, like a melancholy watercolor painting dissolving before our eyes. I stood still for a few seconds, then spoke in a quieter tone than usual. "Did you call me here to discuss work?" Nathaniel turned slowly. His eyes were no longer cold or sharp, but heavy with something unspoken. "No, tonight isn't about work." I didn't know what I had expected, but it wasn't that answer. I nodded slightly, stepping closer. The space between us narrowed. No desk, no schedule separating us anymore. He handed me his glass without a word, and I accepted it, touching my lips to the rim but tasting nothing. Every sense was fixed on the silence between us. "You're stronger than you think," Nathaniel said, still looking out at the rain-washed city. "You haven't just done your job. You've kept this alive." He gestured toward the lights below, or perhaps toward the tangled web of secrets that defined the world we both lived in. I knew he wasn't talking only about work. He was talking about the choices I'd made, the moments I didn't back down, the forgiveness I had offered not out of weakness, but out of strength. I didn't respond. I simply set the glass down and took another step forward. He turned toward me then, for the first time not seeing me as an employee, not as part of the machine, but as a person, someone he truly saw. In that moment, I no longer wore any mask. I wasn't Rachel the assistant. I wasn't Rachel the daughter of Daniel Miller. I was just myself, standing before the man who had pulled me into this world, the man who had kept me here, the man who had forced me to face the parts of myself I had always hidden from. Nathaniel reached out, not demanding, not hurried, but in a gesture of quiet invitation and respect. I placed my hand in his. It was warm, steady, filled with understanding. Neither of us spoke as we let things unfold slowly, each breath measured, deliberate. He lowered his head, his lips brushing my forehead, a gesture so unexpectedly tender it took my breath away. Then he kissed me, for the first time, not to claim, not to control, but because both of us understood what had been growing in the silence between words, in the glances that had carried too much meaning for too long. We said nothing for the rest of the night, letting warmth erase the cold months behind us. It wasn't a night of hurried passion, nor like any closeness I had known before. Every touch was restrained, intentional, listening. It felt fragile, as if a single breath out of rhythm could make it vanish. When I woke the next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the white curtains, bathing my skin in soft gold. Nathaniel was still asleep beside me, his arm draped across me as if afraid I might disappear if he let go. I turned to look at him, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, in this chaotic world, there was still space for something truly gentle. But I also knew the night had changed everything. From now on, we were no longer two people merely coexisting within the same system. Every decision would now be intertwined with emotion and reason. And once feeling begins, it cannot be separated from consequence. But in that quiet morning light, I didn't think about tomorrow. I only thought that at last, there was a place within the arms of this man where I could simply exist, not out of duty, not out of burden, but because I wanted to stay. The days that followed passed with a strange calm, as if after a violent storm, the sky had turned so clear that no one dared believe it had ever raged. I continued to work as usual, following the schedule, stepping into meetings with the quiet composure I had trained myself to wear for months. But something had changed forever. Between moments of work, between silent exchanges of glances, something had begun to flow quietly beneath the surface love, or at least the closest thing to it I had ever known. Nathaniel never spoke of it openly. He didn't alter his behavior in front of others or grant me any obvious privileges, but in every brief touch when handing over a file, in every glance that lingered a heartbeat too long when I entered a room, I knew he remembered that night just as I did. Yet love in this world wasn't like the kind told in romantic tales. There were no flowers, no whispered confessions under candlelight. It existed in the spaces between secret reports, in urgent meetings, in nights broken by the shrill ring of a midnight call. Our love was built of silences, of small gestures, a faint nod when my eyes grew tired from the screen, a cup of coffee made exactly the way he liked waiting on his desk each morning, the way my gaze followed him during difficult decisions no one else could understand the cost of. But with love came another truth I could not ignore: control. Nathaniel was a man of discipline and principle, not because he wanted to control others, but because he had to if he wished to keep this fragile empire from collapsing. And sometimes, that control included me. Once, I asked to leave early to visit my mother. He hesitated a few seconds longer than usual before nodding. Yet that evening I learned Elise had sent someone ahead to check the hospital before I arrived, not because he doubted me, but because he couldn't allow any breach in the chain of security. I understood, but understanding didn't erase the sting. There were moments I wondered whether his affection for me was truly something separate, or merely an extension of the grand architecture of control he had spent his life building. Yet on quiet nights, when we sat side by side saying nothing, the warmth of his hand resting on mine made the doubts fade, at least for a while. To the outside world, we looked like two efficient professionals, precise, detached. But behind closed doors, when the lights dimmed and the city withdrew, I saw another Nathaniel, tired, lonely, and sometimes needing someone beside him so he didn't have to be strong for a while. And I, a woman who had learned to live in fear and solitude, had to learn in turn to accept that someone could stand next to me, share the weight, even briefly. The love between us was an unspoken negotiation, each of us stepping back a little to preserve something fragile taking shape. No one said, "I love you." No one made promises. But both of us knew that if everything were to collapse one day, we would remember this moment as proof that even between power and distrust, behind iron walls and faces veiled by duty, something real could still exist. And I knew, whatever came next, I would never be the same. Because this love, though imperfect, had taught me that even in the darkest places, people can still find one another. I went to the hospital as I did every weekend, carrying a basket of fresh fruit and a few new books for my mother. The sky was gray that day, and a cold wind swept through the row of bare trees along the parking lot, making me shiver despite my thick coat. Her room was on the 7th floor, where the air always smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with the quiet exhaustion of long-term caregivers. I entered, set the bag on the table, smiled at my mother, and gently brushed back the strands of silver in her hair. She was improving, eating better, walking again with the help of a therapist. We talked about small, ordinary things, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. But only a few hours later, that world crashed in with all its cruelty. I was washing my hands in the restroom at the end of the hall when I heard something strange coming from below. It wasn't the wail of an ambulance or the shrill cry of a fire alarm. It was a series of sharp, chaotic sounds running, shouting, something metallic striking the floor. My heart thudded as I stepped into the corridor, watching nurses hastily pull curtains shut and wheel beds back into rooms. One of them whispered, "An intruder. There's an attack on the 3rd floor." I ran to my mother's room, my pulse hammering, and found her still seated, unnervingly calm, as if the chaos outside could never reach her. I locked the door, slid the bolt into place, and dialed Elise's number on my phone. The line was dead. I tried again, 3 times. Nothing. That was when I knew this wasn't a random hospital incident. This was a message, and the intended recipient was me. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. I turned off the lights, motioned for my mother to stay still, and stood behind the door, gripping the phone like a useless weapon. There was a knock, not the kind one makes looking for a friend, but firm, measured, someone who knew exactly where I was. I didn't answer. The knocking stopped. Silence for 10 long seconds. Then a voice, deep, clear, deliberate. "Rachel Miller, open the door. I know you're in there." I tightened my grip. I didn't know who he was, but the way he spoke my name left no doubt this was personal. No one else spoke. Then the footsteps retreated. I waited several minutes, breathing hard, my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. When I finally reached for my phone to call Nathaniel, the screen lit up with a message from an internal number. "Rear exit, 4th floor. Someone's waiting." I didn't know who had sent it, but I had no choice. I helped my mother into her wheelchair, covered her head with a scarf, and pushed her down the hall in the opposite direction. Everything was eerily still. No alarms, no guards. It was as if the hospital had been sealed off entirely. At the emergency stairwell, a man in plain clothes was waiting. He said nothing, only nodded and motioned us to follow. We descended to the 4th floor, passed through a narrow corridor, and stepped out into the back parking lot, where a black SUV was idling. The door opened, and I saw Elise. "Get in," she said, her voice as sharp as ever, though something in it trembled, something that almost sounded like fear. As the car pulled away, I looked back through the window. A figure stood on the 7th floor, exactly where my mother's room was. He didn't move, didn't hide. He simply watched, as if he wanted me to see him. No mask, no attempt to conceal himself, but far enough that I couldn't make out his face. Elise spoke quietly. "The security system was breached from the inside. Someone knew your schedule, knew you'd be here today, knew exactly which room your mother was in. This isn't a threat, it's a warning." I turned to her. "So it's me they're after, not Nathaniel." Elise nodded. "You've stepped out of the neutral zone, Rachel, and that means you're a target." I sat there, hollow inside, not out of fear, but out of the cold realization that, for the first time, I was no longer a bystander. I had become the center of a game whose players had yet to reveal themselves, and I knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same again. When Nathaniel entered the sealed room beneath the main headquarters, his face no longer carried the calm composure I had always known. His anger didn't erupt in words, it moved through him instead, in the heavy weight of each step, in the dark storm of his eyes, in the way his hands clenched as if one wrong word might make him lose control. I had never seen him like this, not when Keegan returned, not when the internal fractures deepened. But now, after my mother had narrowly survived an attack with no trace, from an assailant with no name, aimed squarely at me, Elise stood in the corner, arms folded, silent. No one spoke as Nathaniel reached the center of the room and slammed a stack of files onto the table, the sound sharp and dry. "Who is he?" he asked. His voice was low, but it struck the air like thunder. I knew it wasn't a question, it was an order, and no answer would soothe the fury simmering beneath his restraint. Elise replied succinctly, "We haven't identified him yet. Possibly a remnant faction once loyal to Keegan or an outsider hired in." Nathaniel gave a short, humorless laugh. So after all the layers of control, someone still managed to reach Rachel. At a hospital, under our noses. He turned toward me then, his gaze torn between anger and fear, his voice raw. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, but he didn't wait for the answer. He had already issued orders, the tracking teams were mobilized, internal footage to be combed frame by frame, the list of every person entering that hospital to be reviewed line by line. He spoke with the familiar precision of command, but this time, something else was rising beneath it, a hunger for retribution. He wanted to strike back, to erase anyone who had dared to touch me, to leave no trace behind. But I knew if he went down that path, he would cross the line he had spent his life trying not to. I stepped closer and placed my hand on his shoulder. "Nate, stop." He turned to me, disbelief flickering across his face, as if he hadn't heard me right. "You were targeted. Your mother almost died. And you want me to stop?" I nodded, "Not because I'm not afraid, but because I don't want you to become one of them. If you answer violence with blood, you only prove that violence is the only language this world understands." He said nothing. The rage still burned in him, but under my touch, I felt the tension begin to ease. "You can hate him," I said softly. "You can do everything to protect me, but don't lose the last human part of you, the part that keeps you different from everything you've fought to escape. Don't let this love become an excuse for vengeance." The room fell utterly silent. Elise didn't intervene. She understood, as I did, that only Nathaniel could decide what would happen next. Finally, he exhaled slow, heavy as if releasing a weight he'd carried for too long. "All right," he said. "We'll investigate, to the end. But no blood, no retaliation, no fear traded for peace." I nodded. And for the first time in hours, I saw his eyes soften. Not the eyes of a man who ruled an empire, but of the man I loved, the one still trying to keep his humanity in a world that worshipped power. We didn't embrace then. We didn't speak of love. But the silence between us held something deeper than words, a promise, that no matter what storms lay ahead, we would choose not to lose ourselves. After that night, my place within the system was no longer the same. No official announcement was made, no written appointment, no new office, no nameplate on the door, but the way people looked at me when I entered a meeting had changed. Elise began sending me strategic reports that once went only to Nathaniel. The internal security team started consulting me before launching operations that touched the system's more delicate layers. Even in hallway conversations, I was no longer Callahan's assistant. I was the person people paused for, waiting for my reaction, as though whatever I said might alter the direction of a decision. At first, I was confused. I didn't know when I had become that person. Maybe it happened the moment I stood before Nathaniel in his fury and asked him to choose humanity over power. Or maybe it began when I left the hospital knowing I had become a target and still refused to retreat. Whatever the exact moment, it had brought me here to the realization that I was no longer a small part of the machine. I was a fulcrum, a boundary. And that was what kept me awake through endless nights. Nathaniel never said outright that he had given me a new role, but he allowed everything to unfold as if it were inevitable. Once, when I asked him directly, he looked at me and said quietly that the system needed someone untouched by hatred or ambition, someone who would know when to stop before everything went too far. "You are that person," he said. I was used to enduring in silence, but those words made my heart pound, as though I were standing before a door with no way back. Being the one who held the boundary didn't mean I had absolute power. On the contrary, It meant stepping in at the right moment, saying what no one wanted to hear, stopping what no one else dared to. Once, a liquidation team proposed dissolving a satellite company to erase traces of an illegal transaction. I studied the file and ordered an immediate halt. Buried within the documents was a chain of funding that supported a scholarship program for low-income students. Erasing the company would wipe out hundreds of scholarships. I said if they needed to remove the traces, they must purify, not destroy. Some were displeased. They thought I was weak, sentimental. But Elise only looked at me, nodded, and coolly commanded a complete financial restructuring instead of annihilation. I began to understand that holding the boundary wasn't about defeating evil with good, it was about keeping the system human. It was about resisting the cold logic of survival and profit, reminding everyone that behind every report, every number, there were people living, dreaming, hoping. Gradually, I stopped fearing my role. I didn't need a title or recognition to know my worth. I only needed to remember who I was, and what my father had once chosen. He had died because he refused to close his eyes to wrongdoing, and I would not let that sacrifice go to waste. Late one night, when Nathaniel entered the office and found me still poring over drafts of the new personnel structure, he stood silently for a while before saying, "You're not the woman I met in that bar." I looked up and smiled softly. I am still her. But now I know what I'm capable of, and I won't let anyone cross the line, not even you. He nodded, without anger or pride, because he knew that if anyone could pull him back from the edge, it would be me. And if I didn't, no one else would. In the darkness of power, sometimes it only takes one person daring enough to turn on the light for the lost souls to find their way again. I had chosen to be that person, not for glory, not for love, but because without someone to guard the boundary, everything would eventually collapse. Nathaniel's transformation didn't happen overnight, nor did it resemble a revolution. It began quietly, like hairline cracks spreading across a wall once thought unbreakable, and step by step he began to reveal that he was no longer the man the system had created. The meetings that used to be dry and mechanical, centered on efficiency, profit, and control, now carried strange new questions from him. Why must we do it this way? Is there a way with less harm? What happens to those who cannot protect themselves in the process? At first, his subordinates were unsettled, even uneasy, because they had grown accustomed to a cold, unyielding Callahan. But gradually, they realized that this didn't make him weaker. It made the organization deeper, more human, and less fractured from within. Nathaniel began restructuring the risk management division. Instead of simply punishing, he wanted to prevent misconduct at its roots through education, behavioral analysis, and timely intervention. He also dismantled the branches once loyal to Keegan, the ones he had previously tolerated for the sake of balance. Now there was no reason to keep such remnants, and he removed them not with force but through careful, lawful steps that left no vacuum to be exploited. A new advisory board was formed, including members from outside the organization. They were not only skilled strategists but people with unshakable moral foundations. Elise was cautious at first, yet she was the one who eventually admitted that without such people, every discussion in the boardroom would remain an echo chamber. Through all of this, I saw clearly that Nathaniel wasn't doing it for me. Even if I had been a catalyst, what he was building came from his own understanding that true power doesn't lie in the ability to impose, but in the courage to change while preserving one's core values. One night, after a 4-hour meeting with the board, I found him sitting alone in his office, the warm light casting his shadow against the ceiling like a solitary portrait. I walked in and sat beside him without a word. He looked at me and smiled a weary smile, but no longer the haunted kind. "You know," he said softly, "there was a time I thought the only way to keep this system safe was to be as cold as steel. Never let anyone see the cracks." I squeezed his hand gently. "And now you know that letting people see your flaws makes them trust you more." Nathaniel didn't reply. He simply rested his head lightly on my shoulder. Not long after, he made a decision that stunned everyone. He announced that he would temporarily step back from direct command, transferring part of his authority to the new advisory board, tasked with rebuilding the organization into something more transparent and sustainable. He never called it a retreat. He said it was a change in position so he could see everything more clearly. And just as he predicted, the organization didn't collapse. Instead, it seemed steadier, calmer, more alive. For me, that transformation was the clearest proof of one thing. Nathaniel hadn't let the darkness shape him to the end. He had chosen to stop at the edge. And by doing so, he not only saved himself but opened a different path for all of us. A path not everyone would dare to take, but one that, once someone does, changes everything forever. That afternoon, the sky over Chicago was impossibly blue, not a single cloud clinging to it, as if someone had washed the city clean of all its weary dust. Nathaniel asked me to take a walk, something he rarely did, especially after the transition of power. We strolled along the edge of Lake Michigan, where the wind carried the scent of cold water and the soft rhythm of waves brushing the shore. He didn't speak much, and I stayed silent too, feeling every step beside him as a quiet kind of peace I had never known before. When we stopped at a wooden bench facing the lake, Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in dark blue velvet. He placed it in my palm, his eyes softening as if he were looking at a part of himself resting there. I didn't need to unwrap it to know what it was, not because I had expected it, nor because there had been any sign, but because that moment held a stillness so whole, so certain, that it could only belong to a promise. Nathaniel didn't kneel. He simply sat beside me, looked straight into my eyes, and spoke in a low, steady voice that I knew had been carefully measured. "Rachel," he said, "I can't promise this world will ever be easy. I can't promise the storms are over. But I know one thing. I don't want to walk any road that doesn't have you beside me. You're not just the person who changed me. You're the one who held me back when I thought I had nothing left but power and darkness. So if you still believe in this love, even just a little, I'm asking you, please, stay." I unwrapped the velvet. The ring wasn't ornate, no large stone, just a simple band of white gold with 2 small engraved letters inside D, M, and N, C, intertwined, my father's initials and his. Nathaniel had carved the name of the man I never stopped missing into the ring he meant to wear with me for life. I didn't cry. I only looked at him for a long time, as though trying to read every corner of the heart of a man who had once wanted to conquer the world, yet now placed that same heart in my hands, unguarded. "I used to think love was born of romance," I said softly, "of sweet promises and movie-perfect moments. But looking back at everything we've been through, I realize real love isn't about never falling, it's about learning to stand again, together, even when everything seems to have fallen apart. I don't know if I'll ever be a good wife. I don't even know if I'm strong enough to walk beside you forever in this layered world. But if love means looking straight at each other's fears and still choosing to stay, then maybe this is what love truly is." I didn't need time to think. I took his hand, slipped the ring onto my finger, and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "I'll stay." And this time, not because I need someone to save me, but because I want to be the one who walks with you. We sat there for a long while, watching the sunlight shimmer across the lake's surface, saying nothing more. There were no crowds, no applause, no flowers, no music. But in that simplicity, that sincerity, I knew we had given each other the deepest thing one person can offer another, the choice to walk together not out of need, but out of trust. And trust, in a world so full of doubt, is the truest definition of love. One early autumn morning, as the leaves turned golden and the wind carried the gentle chill of a changing season, Nathaniel and I stood together on the balcony of our high-rise apartment, the city stretching beneath us like a quiet map. Sunlight touched the steam rising from his coffee cup, casting a soft glow across his face, something tender I had never seen before. Neither of us spoke of the future with certainty. There were no wedding plans, no guest lists, no grand venues. All we had was a single, shared decision to stay beside each other, one day at a time, in a world that refused to stay still. The organization Nathaniel once led had changed. It was no longer built on fear or absolute control. It now functioned like an ecosystem with structure, restraint, and above all, responsibility. I continued my role as the keeper of its moral boundary, not only with reason but with the heart of someone who had once walked through darkness and learned to recognize the worth of light. My mother recovered better than anyone expected. She started reading again, and sometimes called just to ask if the new dish she tried tasted good. Small things like that, once buried beneath the weight of survival, had become real happiness. There were still days I questioned whether choosing to walk beside Nathaniel was right, but whenever I saw him patiently listening to a junior employee's opinion, or pausing to rest a hand on a doorman's shoulder and ask sincerely how he was, I knew he was changing not because of me, but because he had discovered another world within himself. And that made me believe that sometimes, loving someone isn't about changing them, but helping them see the beauty that was always there, waiting to be awakened. Our story doesn't end like a fairy tale, but it does have a new beginning every day where two people, once wounded and guarded, now learn to live honestly with each other and with themselves. Love in this world isn't about rescue or escape, it's about the courage to face life together. And perhaps the deepest lesson I've learned is this. Sometimes the hardest part isn't loving someone, but allowing yourself to be loved and believing that you are worthy of it. Thank you for staying with us through this moving and inspiring journey. If this story touched something within you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of Rachel and Nathaniel's journey? Have you ever faced a choice between reason and heart in your own life? Share your feelings with us. We'd love to hear the truest voice from your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, to continue exploring heartfelt, meaningful stories every day. We look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Wishing you good health, serenity, and days filled with peace and love. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next story.